talk about these modes in relation to the Yiddish modes now.
These in relation?
Yeah.
Or I'm supposed to just talking about the...
These in relation to that, or start wherever you want. But the thing is that people have these pieces of paper, to look at right now, and we can refer to them as possibly.
Why don't we start with Yiddish and work out?
Yeah.
Okay.
In 10 minutes.
Well, the first thing that I'll say in relation to these modes, this is really only my own opinion. There are definitely modes, musical modes that we find in Yiddish music that are very similar or nearly identical to these in certain respects. And the only negative thing I have to say, or the caution I have, is I've known people to assume, well, many people, even many people who speak the Yiddish language think that Yiddish is not a real language. There are people who are apologists for it, who refer to it as something you can only learn by growing up with it, that has no grammar, for instance. I've heard people who really know Yiddish say, oh, but you can't learn it because it has no grammar. You have to be Jewish and then you can speak Yiddish. Or something like this. And this is a false assumption based on being told of such things, being told, oh, what you have is... I've known people to see the correspondence of the modes in Yiddish music to the Turkish Arabic modal system, to see that it is less structured, less organized in a theoretical sense, and therefore assume, oh, well, so what we're playing is like a bastardized version of the real modal system. And I've known a few people even to try to change their interpretation of the modes in Jewish music to try and make them more like the Turkish mode, thinking, oh, we have to make the little microtones. But there seems to be a lot of musicological evidence that the use of these modes in Jewish music did not come directly or even secondarily from the Arabic system. Possibly that the Turkish Arabic use of these modes comes from a similar common source to that that may have, in a distant time, also influenced the Jewish music. I can't offer these specific evidence, but certainly there's evidence that Jewish music made use of modes like this before the culture came into frequent direct contact with other traditions using that same, at least in the Turkish sense of the system. I'm kind of blabbing about it. The only thing I want to say is I want to avoid the assumption that there's somehow a derivation or that we have to justify the Jewish mode in terms of the Turco-Arabic system. On the other hand, if one musically finds something interesting in one or the other system and can borrow from it, that's how music is made. So there's no rule against doing such things. I want to avoid the perception that we're saying, okay, this is the real thing, and then the Jewish modes are somehow vaguely like that or something.
The language metaphor is good, again, here, because as Kurt said at the beginning, Yiddish is a real language, and it's a complex real language, just like German is a real language, with all the different dialects that are spoken of German. There are different dialects of Yiddish, but all of those dialects belong together in the family of Yiddish, which is in important ways different from the family of contemporary German languages. And then you can be a Yiddish poet who borrows a word that only exists in German in your Yiddish poem because you think it has an interesting effect. So you can be a klezmer musician, artist, who borrows something from a Turkish mode or who is influenced it in some other way because you like the artistic effect of that. But in order to do that well, you have to understand both the musical languages that you're dealing with. I think that's the idea.
Yeah. Awesome.
So let's talk about what those modes are.
Although I have to actually, I see it a little differently, that there is a great deal of interaction between a lot of influence of whether we call them Turkish modes or Greek modes or the modal system of Southeastern Europe and Asia Minor, a great deal of influence of that obviously into the Balkans, partly because of Turkish influence and partly because of probably earlier Byzantine influence and just the fact that the music of those regions, like I was talking about, similarity in both the modes and the interaction of the modes, the modulatory scheme, the ways that modulations occur, particularly in klezmer music, but also in Yiddish folk song and in cantorial music, in Yiddish liturgical music. That's very similar and very much influenced by the Ottoman musical world. But it may have existed there, I think probably did, prior to the Ottoman Empire. But it's not clear exactly how far back this stuff goes. Okay, so let's go with that.
We're going to just have to get started on this.
Yeah, the general thing I would say is that I think in most cases in Jewish music, the regularity of the modal system is more like what Orhan said about Greek music. There are tunes that we will describe as being in this mode or that mode, but you'll find frequently that elements of different modes get mixed up together. And among the last living generation of old klezmorim that I had any contact with, it seems that they were not terribly conscious of specific modes. They recognized certain tendencies, but there was hardly a belief that a certain tune needed to be in a certain mode or that there were any rules to follow. Rather that they were carrying forth a legacy of melodies and creating their own new melodies, but there was no sense that they had to create new melodies and stick to some rule or system of modality that had existed.
Yeah. I think the way the musicians you're talking about, the older generation, do use names for the modes, I think the way they use those names is a way that I've also found Greek and Armenian musicians use the name of a mode or just the name of a note to tell each other where they're starting the song from. So the Yiddish musicians would do the same thing. They would say, this one, when they say this one's in Phrygish, they mean that the first or main melody that they play is largely in Phrygish. But that doesn't necessarily categorize the entire tune. It's just a useful shorthand for telling each other where they're starting. Whereas a jazz musician will say, this tune is in D flat. A Greek musician might hear the same tune, and if the first chord is a D minor, he might say D minor. A jazz musician will think the tune is in D minor, but a Greek musician will understand that it starts on the D minor. It doesn't mean that it ends there or is thought of as being primarily there. So I think if we say a tune is in Phrygish, it doesn't mean the tune is entirely in Phrygish. It just means that's what you have to know in order to start playing together.
Well, that was the 55-minute hour right there. So I guess we'll look at the Jewish modes tomorrow.
Okay.
Let's take 5 minutes to stretch and get your instruments, those who need to do it, and we'll go to the next thing.
Well, I don't know if we have to.
We just sing it.
That's nice. I can tsimbel. I can sing a version of it, but Kurt has probably a very developed version of it.
Can we do it in B since it's the same key?
It'll be a lot easier than because I know what to do.
Yeah, let's do it however you want.